The silence after betrayal is the loudest thing in the universe. Admiral Ethan Cross stood at the floor-to-ceiling viewport of the UES Ironclad, watching the stars with the stillness of a man who had already made his decision, and buried the grief that came with it. Behind him, the hum of the ship's war core resonated through the deck plating, steady as a heartbeat, cold as a verdict. 3 months ago, the Sovereignty Pact had held 47 civilizations together in the largest military coalition the Milky Way had ever seen. Humans had bled for that pact. They had given it credibility when no one else would. When the Vorith Dominion swept through the outer reaches, it was humanity's fleets that held the line at Kasara Station while the other races pulled their ships back for strategic repositioning. Strategic repositioning. Cross let the phrase rot in his memory where it belonged. Then came the conclave of Tarsus. The 46 other sovereignty races had gathered without invitation to humanity. They voted in secret. They signed a separate armistice with the Vorith, one that handed over the contested mining corridors of the Shattered Belt in exchange for peace. Resources that humanity had defended with 60,000 lives. Given away, in a backroom deal, while Admiral Cross was still pulling his wounded ships out of the debris field at Kasara. And the terms of the armistice included one final clause, buried in diplomatic language, dressed in the polite vocabulary of necessary transition and galactic stability. Humanity would disarm. Reduce its fleet to a peacekeeping complement. Submit its shipyard production to sovereignty oversight. They hadn't asked. They had decided. High Marshal Cale Veron of the Enemy Alliance had smiled through the broadcast announcement. He was a tall figure, blue-gray in complexion, with 4 arms and the kind of confidence that came from centuries of watching lesser civilizations fold under pressure. Humanity has served its purpose, Veron had said. It is time they learn their place in a post-war galaxy. Cross had watched the broadcast 3 times. Not because he needed to hear it again, but because he wanted to remember exactly how it felt. Rage, yes. But beneath the rage, something colder. Something that quietly began calculating. He turned from the viewport. "Commander Reyes," he said. "Sir." His executive officer stepped forward from the bridge crew, tablet in hand, face composed in the way of someone who had also been carrying this weight for weeks. "Send the signal. All fleets." "Confirmation code, sir?" Prometheus rising. What humanity did next, they did quietly. That was the thing the sovereignty races never understood about humans. They assumed loudness was power. Veron's people broadcasted every military action, every alliance negotiation, every threat and triumph, because spectacle was their authority. Humans had learned something different in their long and violent history on a single, lonely planet. The most dangerous move is the one your enemy doesn't see coming. For 37 days, nothing appeared to change. Human fleets maintained their standard patrol routes. Diplomatic communications continued on schedule. Trade convoys moved normally through sovereignty checkpoints. The Sovereignty Oversight Committee sent its first inspection delegation to the Titan-class shipyard at Callaway Station, and found exactly what they expected to find: reduced production, cooperative staff, meticulous records. They filed a positive report. They didn't know that Callaway Station was the only shipyard they would ever be allowed to see. Across 17 star systems, in asteroid-shielded construction bays and deep-orbit facilities that didn't appear on any shared navigational charts, humanity had been building for 2 years. Not since the Kasara campaign. Not since the betrayal. Since before, because Admiral Cross had studied history, and history told him one thing with absolute consistency: alliances built on convenience collapse at the moment of maximum inconvenience. He had prepared accordingly. The ships that emerged from those hidden yards weren't the same generation as the vessels the Sovereignty had catalogued. The Prometheus-class carriers were 30% larger than anything in the human registry. Their drive cores used a compression-fold geometry that humanity's engineers had been developing in classified labs since the Kasara campaign. Their point defense grids used a targeting architecture borrowed, improved upon, really, from Vorath technology that human intelligence had quietly reverse-engineered from salvage. They were not peacekeeping vessels. They were not defensive platforms. They were the answer to the question, what happens when you corner a species that survived 200,000 years on the hardest planet in the system? High Marshal Kale Veyron received the data packet on the morning of the 38th day. It came through a standard diplomatic channel, flagged routine, opened by an aide who immediately summoned Veyron's senior staff. Within the hour, Veyron himself was standing over a holographic tactical display, staring at the fleet composition humans had transmitted without comment, without ultimatum, without drama. Just the facts. 212 Prometheus-class carriers. 47 Cassara-class destroyers, named, apparently, after the battle. 96 rapid deployment strike wings, each equipped with fold-capable fighters that could appear inside standard defensive perimeters before point defense systems could initialize. And one short message, authored personally by Admiral Ethan Cross, transmitted to every Sovereignty Council member simultaneously. The disarmament proposal is declined. Sovereignty oversight of human military production is declined. The conclave of Tarsus Armistice, in all clauses pertaining to human territorial and military concessions, is void. We have reviewed the terms you offered and found them written in the assumption that we had no alternative. We did. We chose not to use it until you gave us no reason to hold back. Consider this our resignation from the Sovereignty Pact, effective immediately, and our formal notification that any fleet entering human-administered space without prior authorization will be treated as a hostile incursion. We wish you well. Do not test us. Veyron stood very still for a long moment. One of his senior commanders broke the silence. They can't have built all of this since. They didn't, Veyron said quietly. He understood it then. Not just the fleet. All of it. The patience. The cooperative inspections. The standard patrol routes. Humanity had played the part of the obedient junior partner while simultaneously preparing an exit that left the sovereignty with no lever, no threat, no option. You couldn't threaten to destroy what had already been built. You couldn't sanction a civilization that no longer needed your trade corridors. You couldn't enforce an armistice on a fleet that outnumbered your combined rapid response forces by a ratio that the display in front of him made very clear and very final. What are our options? He asked. The room was quiet for much longer than it should have been. The renegotiation was not called a renegotiation. It was called a comprehensive galactic security dialogue, which was the sovereignty's way of asking for a meeting without admitting they were asking for a meeting. Admiral Cross attended in person, aboard a Prometheus-class carrier that the sovereignty delegation was invited to tour, an invitation that was, in its own way, a message. The new terms were written by humans. The shattered belt mining corridors were returned to human administrative jurisdiction. The armistice clause requiring human disarmament was formally struck. Sovereignty oversight of human shipyard production was reclassified as inapplicable. In exchange, humanity agreed to re-enter a modified version of the Mutual Defense Framework, on the condition that any future security decisions affecting human territory required human consent. Veyron signed the document with 4 hands and the expression of a man swallowing something difficult. Cross watched him without satisfaction, or if he felt it, he did not let it reach his face. This wasn't about victory. It wasn't about punishment. It was about establishing, with precision and permanence, where the line was. You built your contingency before the betrayal, Veyron said quietly, after the signing, when the delegations had stepped away and the two of them stood alone near the viewport. He wasn't accusing. He was, Cross realized, genuinely trying to understand. We built our contingency, Cross replied, because we've been betrayed before. By our own kind, by allies, by circumstances. We're very old, Marshal, even if we arrive to the stars late. We know what it looks like when trust becomes liability. Veyron looked at the stars outside the viewport. What would you have done if we hadn't called for a dialogue? Cross was quiet for a moment. Then, we would have been fine. It was not a threat. It was not a boast. It was simply the truth, delivered with the calm of a species that had learned, long ago, on a small and turbulent planet, that the only thing more dangerous than a human backed into a corner was a human who had seen the corner coming and prepared the door before you arrived. Veyron said nothing more. Outside, the stars burned on, indifferent, ancient, and now, quietly, rearranged.